You're listening to
Campus Killings.
brought to you by AbJack Entertainment. Be sure to check out some of the other great true crime podcasts from this network, including The Murder in My Family, DNA ID, Zodiac Speaking, Scene of the Crime, Missing Persons,
Beyond Bizarre True Crime,
and
Citizen Detective.
all of these podcasts are available for you to binge on right now, wherever you listen to podcasts. Subscribe where you're listening to this podcast so you don't miss an episode.
Hello, Megan, and hello, listeners. Today's case is a little bit different from what we usually cover. First, we won't be focusing on any particular university in this episode. Instead, we'll be looking at a big college tradition, and that is the spring break trip. And Megan, I am assuming you've gone away on spring break. Tell me quickly, where have you been on your spring breaks?
Well, I only went on one. I had
Okay.
to save up for it and work hard for it, but I went to Italy.
What? Oh, in college?
Yeah.
Okay, well, I hope no one's
What,
gonna...
you went to Florida or something, like
Well-
Panama City or...
Well, I hope no one throws shade at my parents, but as a senior in high school, I went to Cancun, Mexico, with just a group of other seniors in high school, not chaperoned. And that was quite the experience. And then every year in college, we would do either Fort Lauderdale, Miami. Spring break was very big because my best friend went to college in Florida. So we used to drive down and go visit her every spring break. So much fun.
Well, weren't you lucky? Some of us just had to work hard and save for it.
Oh, well, you know.
Actually, that's not true. I only paid for a little bit. My parents told me they would treat me to one spring break, they said. They had no idea that I was going to pick Italy, though. They thought I'd pick Florida.
Oh, that's funny. Yeah, I don't know that I would have been able to swing Italy as a as a college student, but that's pretty cool. All right.
Cool.
Not as much of a fun topic. We're also going to be doing a deep dive on Mexican drug cartels and also some occult religions and practices. So I know this might sound strange, but I promise it all ties back to our subject for today's episode, and that is Mark Kilroy. And I do want to give an extra trigger warning for today's case, because a little bit later on, we will be discussing occult rituals that involve human sacrifice and other topics that might be particularly disturbing to some listeners. So, extra listener discretion is advised for today.
Whoa.
So instead of giving background on the university like we normally do, I'm going to start with a little history on the whole concept of spring break and how it evolved into what we know it as today. Megan, I'm assuming you don't know the history of spring break, do you? Because I certainly didn't.
I sure do not.
All right. Well, this is super interesting. Okay. This is taking us back to 1936 when a swim coach named Sam Ingram from Colgate University in New York decided to use the week that the college gave off for Easter to fly the swim team down to Fort Lauderdale. Now, I'm sure have you been to Fort Lauderdale for spring break?
No, I've only been to Italy, I
okay.
told you. Sorry.
All right, so Sam and his team were going to take advantage of the nice weather and the pools in Florida. And over the next 2 years, many other northern swim coaches saw the brilliance in this and also began taking their teams down for week-long practices in Fort Lauderdale during the Easter break. By 1938, a formal swim forum was created to organize all the swim teams coming down for practice. And as the amount of swimmers arriving over the next decade expanded greatly, Fort Lauderdale businesses realized that they could make a lot of money off of these college-age tourists. And this is when businesses began advertising spring break specials over the next 2 decades. But what really made the concept take off was a novel about 4 college girls who went to Florida for spring break and the antics they got into. Now, this book was called Where the Boys Are by Glendon Swarthout, and the novel was published in 1960. And later, MGM would turn it into a hit movie. Have you ever heard of that?
Yes, I have.
You have? You know
Yes,
everything
I
about
have.
movies.
I do. That's what it is. But I don't think I've seen it, but I've heard of it. Absolutely.
With the film and novel's success and popularity, U.S. college students began flocking to Fort Lauderdale from all over the nation to try to have the same experiences as the characters. In fact, Fort Lauderdale became so iconic as a spring break destination, it was given the moniker Fort Lickerdale due to the amount of drunk co-eds on the streets during the 5 weeks between March and April.
Oh, that seems fitting, though.
As the concept of spring break widened, 2 other locations became hot destinations, and this would include Cancun, Mexico, and also where our story begins, South Padre Island, Texas. In March of 1989, 21-year-old Mark Kilroy had just finished his last test for a pre-med class at the University of Texas. And he was really looking forward for a well-deserved break with 3 of his best friends from high school. While all 4 men went to different universities, they've become fast friends at Santa Fe High School in South Texas, and they remained close even as they all parted ways after graduation. And though their college experiences had taken them far from home, they still held on tightly to small-town values. All of them would call their families weekly. They were accomplished. Now, these guys were straight-A students. None of them did drugs, and as one journalist called them, quote, they were the kind of boys you would like your daughter to marry.
No.
As they were all in their senior years, they had discussed that this might be the last time that they were able to do a spring break together, and that it was important to make it as memorable as possible. So on the afternoon of March 10th, Mark and his friends drove the 9-hour trip from their hometown of Santa Fe through foggy roads to get to South Padre Island just before midnight. And they were some of the first spring breakers to arrive. So after they hit a few of the bars that were still open, the 4 of them checked into the Sheraton Hotel and got some sleep before the big festivities the next day. Now on the next day, March 11th, thousands of co-eds began arriving, and South Padre Island was taken over by beer corporations providing free concerts, movies, surf simulator activities, and opportunities to be in commercials. Coupled with this were the regular businesses and bars running drink specials and all-night hours. So Mark and his friends were very excited about an upcoming event. Now this event was called the Miss Tan Line Contest, and I've never been to one of these, but I can bet it involved a fair amount of female nudity.
Yes, Amy, I'm going to have to say tan line competition probably does involve some skin.
Okay. The friends' general schedule over the next 2 days consisted of staying out at the bars all night, napping on the beach for several hours in the morning before going back to the hotel to shower and get some food. Then they would head out to watch the daily Miss Tan Line contest before returning to the bars. But the men didn't plan to just stay in South Padre. They were also looking forward to heading over the border into Mexico, where the larger border town of Matamoros had lax drinking laws and the beer was incredibly cheap.
No, of course.
On the evening of March 12th, the group drove down the dusty 24-mile road to the border of Texas and Mexico. They parked on the Texas side and then walked the footbridge over to Matamoros, where a similar scene to what had been in South Padre greeted them. Spring breakers clogged the tight streets, and the 4 men found a bar called Sergeant Pepper's, where they spent the rest of the night with a group of young women from the University of Kansas. As dawn broke, the co-eds parted ways, with Mark and his friends heading back to their hotel in South Padres. The group had had so much fun that they decided to go back for a second night, leaving their hotel around 10:30 p.m. on March 13th to again make the 24-mile trek back to the border. And once again, they would leave their car on the Texas side and walk over the footbridge to Matamoros. By this point, spring break was in full swing, and over 15,000 college students were packed into the tight main street. Bars and clubs were overflowing with people, and trying to get anywhere in the area pretty much meant holding on to whoever you were hanging out with and just pushing your way through the crowd. Lines for bars were wrapped around dark alleys, so Mark and his friends decided on a bar that had a shorter wait time. But they went there, deemed the bar too quiet and not enough fun, so they left and ended up at a place called the London Pub. Now, this place had rebranded itself as the Hard Rock for spring break.
Ah, gotcha.
Now, this bar was packed with people, and Mark's friends recalled sitting at the bar and having beer cans thrown at them from the balcony above by drunk patrons. Now, I guess this is a fun time for college students.
Sounds awful to me, but okay.
Now, at this bar, Mark met a few women and went off with them for a while, but he returned to his friends around 2 a.m. And it was then that the group agreed it was probably time to head back to South Padres. As they emerged out onto the street, it seemed that most of the other tourists had the same idea, and the streets once again became clogged with co-eds who were heading back towards the footbridge to go back to Texas. As they were leaving, Mark recognized a woman who had been in the Miss Tan Line competition earlier in the week, so he left his friends to go and talk to her. Meanwhile, 2 of his friends went into a convenience store to wait for him, and a third friend stepped into a local alley to relieve himself. But when they came back a few minutes later, Mark had simply vanished, and none of his friends knew where he had gone. They started searching the area, they went back to the bar they were at, They looked for him down the main street until virtually all of the tourists had gone and all of the bars were closed. And after several unsuccessful hours, they finally went back to their car, hoping that maybe Mark had just gone to the parking lot. Now, as a reminder, we're talking 1989, so there are no cell phones and no way to contact each other.
And they must have been panicking. I mean, really panicking.
I mean, I would imagine they were all probably intoxicated. And if he was talking to this female, maybe they thought he went home with her or, I don't know. I don't know how panicked they were.
Yeah, but they're across the border. They're not, they're in Mexico. That's why I mean panicking, because they're not, in the U.S. And I would think losing a friend there without cell phones.
Yeah.
I don't know. I would think they'd be panicking.
I think the group did start to panic when they got back to the parking lot and Mark was no longer there. So at this point, they were thinking, you know what, maybe he went back to the hotel. Again, maybe he had gone home with the woman from the competition. But the problem is they got back to the hotel and he was not there either. And by the afternoon, they were so worried that they contacted both the U.S. and Mexican police to put in a missing persons report.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, most missing persons reports in the Matamoros area never amounted to much. Besides spring breakers disappearing on a bender and turning up a day or two later, many locals were also known to go missing and simply never reappear. The area outside of Matamoros was mostly impoverished, and no one had enough money to pressure the Mexican police to do much in the way of searching for missing people. In fact, Megan, get this, Mark was the 60th person to have disappeared from the area since January of 1989.
Whoa.
That's 2 months.
Big number.
Yeah.
That's scary. Something going on.
However, unlike the impoverished locals, Mark was a middle-class, white, college-going male from the U.S., and he happened to have family in high places.
And now, a brief word from our sponsors.
After Mark's parents found out that he was missing, they told Mark's uncle, Ken Kilroy, who was a member of the Los Angeles-based U.S. Customs Department. Once Ken found out that his nephew had disappeared in Matamoros, he was able to use his connections to get a police task force to search the border town of Brownville, and this is where the young men had parked their car before crossing the footbridge. And once the task force began asking questions, the Mexican federal police, known as the Federales, were called out to partner with the U.S. Marshals in the investigation. As custom agents went back with Mark's friends to retrace their steps from the night of his disappearance, the Mexican police questioned potential witnesses and they took in tips. And it would soon become clear that Mark had most likely been kidnapped. But by who and for what purpose remained an enigma. His parents had not gotten any ransom letters or phone calls, and as Mark didn't do drugs, it seemed somewhat implausible that he was met with foul play over a back alley drug deal. Now, there was a third option, and one that law enforcement thought most likely, and that was that Mark had been kidnapped, robbed, and then murdered, which meant that his body had likely been disposed of in a remote location. Now, I'm not sure why they so quickly jumped to that conclusion, but I would imagine they knew what would go on in the area, and they had seen something like this before.
Yeah.
Helicopters and search teams went out to scour the local rivers for his body, and all-terrain vehicles from Border Patrol searched the surrounding deserts and fields. But no human remains were uncovered. And while law enforcement searched, Mark's family traveled from their home in Santa Fe to the border where they distributed over 20,000 flyers about Mark's disappearance. They also offered up to a $15,000 reward for anyone who could help them locate their son. When no progress had been made in the case by the end of March, Mark's story was covered by America's Most Wanted to see if putting national attention on the case might generate more leads. But while police got hundreds of tips and letters after the air date, none of them amounted to anything. But despite this, the Kilroy family and their community continued raising money to print missing flyers and launch search parties, but unfortunately, there was still no trace of Mark. But a break would soon come from an unlikely place. On April 1st of 1989, Mexican federales were conducting a drug stop checkpoint between the Texas border and Matamoros when a truck sped out of Texas right through the checkpoint without stopping. Clearly, they suspected that something was suspicious about this vehicle, so federales followed the truck in an unmarked car to see where it was headed. The truck stopped at a ranch only a few miles outside of Matamoros. This area was known as Santa Elena, and the federales knew that there was drug activity that came out of the ranch. so they decided to watch the place for a few hours to see if they could gather any evidence. Now, during their surveillance, they noted that the driver of the truck went into the ranch and then came out a bit later and drove off back towards Matamoros, but no one else seemed to be around. So they did a cursory search of the property, which I guess they're allowed to do because we're talking about different rules than we have here in the U.S.
Mm-hmm.
During this search, they discovered 30 kilos of marijuana, but more importantly and far more sinister, they discovered a shed near the back of the property. And this shed contained melted candles, cigar butts, a series of greasy cauldrons containing what looked like blood and animal parts, and empty glass bottles.
Boy, not good.
The federales knew immediately that this shed had been used for an occult ritual. I'm assuming they had seen this before because I'm not sure that that would be my first impression of these items.
I assume they'd seen it before as well.
Yeah, so just to help us understand a little bit more as to why they made that judgment so quickly, I think we need to understand a little of South American culture. Much of South America, and Mexico is no exception, has a legacy of mixing Christianity, brought by the conquistadors, and ancient indigenous religions like those of the Aztecs. And though industrialization wiped out many of the indigenous practices through the ages, even in the late 1880s, one could still find talismans and other paraphernalia thought to ward off evil or cast curses at Mexican markets. Likewise, ancient superstitions about demons and other worldly entities were still an active part of Mexican culture at this time. And the federales would have either prescribed to these beliefs themselves or understood them as being active in the community. Based on their knowledge of the old indigenous beliefs, it would have been easy for them to denote that what they were looking at had been used for dark magic. As for the continued search of the property, they came across a caretaker living in a different shack. On an off chance, they showed the caretaker a photo of Mark Kilroy and asked if he had seen the college co-ed in the area. To their surprise, the caretaker admitted that not only had he seen Mark, but that a few weeks back he'd fed him breakfast while the young man had been handcuffed in the back of a Suburban that was parked in the ranch's equipment yard.
Whoa.
Even more, the caretaker gave the names of the two men who had done the handcuffing, and this would be Elio Hernandez Rivera and Serafin Hernandez Garcia. While neither men were on the property at the time, the police continued to survey the property, and only a few days later, both Elio and Serafin returned, and they were immediately arrested and taken in for interrogation. During the questioning, both Elio and Serafin admitted to kidnapping Mark Kilroy. Serafin explained that their boss, a man by the name of Adolfo Costanzo, had specifically instructed his followers to find him, quote, a gringo college boy to be used as a human sacrifice for their next ritual. Now, Costanzo was a known cult leader who practiced a mixture of an African Caribbean religion called the Palo Mayombe and also voodoo. And unfortunately, Mark Kilroy just happened to be their target. It's unknown why exactly Mark stood out to the kidnappers. They never really stated why they chose him, but it could be, that he was alone in a sea of people, or maybe he was distracted talking to that young woman. Whatever the reason, Serafin and Elio say that they wrestled Mark to the ground and loaded him in the Suburban on that fateful night. Serafin reported that at one point they had to stop, and Mark managed to escape the vehicle and he started running down the street. Unfortunately, Serafin caught him, and that's the point where he handcuffed Mark, stuffed him in the back of the Suburban, and they drove him directly to the Santa Elena Ranch where they left him in the car overnight.
Oh, God, the terror of this.
The next morning, the caretaker was instructed to feed him, and then Elio came out to duct tape Mark's eyes and mouth before they led him to the ritual shed. Now, again, these next few details are quite graphic, so I just wanted to give yet another warning about that. Over the next several hours, Mark was tortured and repeatedly raped by cult leader Costanzo before he took Mark out into a field, offered him up as sacrifice to the Palo Mayombe gods, and killed him via a machete to the back of the skull.
Oh, my God.
Once dead, Serafin explained that the rest of the ritual involved removing Mark's brain, heart, lungs, and testicles, and boiling them in a cauldron along with animal bones to make a stew that was then drank by the cult members. After the ritual, Serafin explained that Mark's legs were dismembered for easier burial, and a metal wire was laced through his spinal cord, and then Serafin buried his remains in a shallow grave. When asked about the wire, Serafin explained that it was so that when Mark's body had decomposed, the cult members could easily pull his bones back up to make them into necklaces of protection. I don't know what that means.
It's like magic. They think that the bones are then going to protect them from something. You know what I mean? Body parts give them magical powers is basically what it means.
On April 11th, almost a month after Mark had gone missing, federales took Serafin back to the ranch and under gunpoint demanded that he dig up Mark's remains. He did so, able to identify Mark's burial spot by the wires sticking up out of the ground. But federales realized that there were many sunken earth spots with stuck-up wires throughout the area.
Ugh.
Mark was not their only victim. Under continued gunpoint, Serafin and another arrested cult member, Sergio Martinez, were ordered to dig up all of the shallow graves, and in total, 15 mutilated bodies were discovered across the property in various stages of decomposition. Like Mark, all were men and had had their organs removed and had either been killed via a slashed throat or decapitation.
Amy, do we know why the cult members were sacrificing human beings? Like, to what end?
Yeah, I think that's a good question and one that a lot of listeners probably have. So to try to make sense of all this, let's take a minute to talk about the cult leader, Adolfo Costanzo. Adolfo was a Cuban-American whose stepfather made his living through drug trafficking between South America and Miami, Florida. And he was very involved in occult religions. Adolfo's mother was also into the occult, and she raised her son in the practice of Santeria, which can involve animal sacrifices. His mother also believed that Adolfo was a psychic and encouraged him to utilize his abilities. At the age of 18, she sent him to learn another religion, the Palo Mayombe, which was similar to Santeria. But instead of animal sacrifices, the rituals used human parts stolen from graveyards. In only a year, Adolfo became what was known as a, quote, high priest of Palo Mayombe and set out to make his way in the world. And Megan, he was very attractive and he had a charismatic personality. So after moving to Mexico City in 1984, he was quickly able to climb the city's social ladder due to his perceived ability to predict the future. And he became very sought after by high-level drug lords, public persons, and even some law enforcement for his, quote, cleansings and sacrificial religions that he promised would ensure their safety and success. One of these drug lords was the head of the Hernandez gang who owned Santa Elena Ranch. While it's unclear exactly how the Hernandez gang came to meet Adolfo, one theory suggests that Elio Hernandez, then again, that's one of the men who kidnapped Mark. One theory says that he was dating a student at Texas Southmost College who was Adolfo's biggest recruiter for his cult. Once introduced, Adolfo offered to be the Hernandez's official high priest. This would basically consist of him providing spiritual and physical protection to all of the gang members, and this would be in return for a share of their drug profits. Described by one journalist as, quote, Manson-esque in his persuasion abilities, Adolfo made up the rules of the cult as he went along. He would mix Palo Mayombe, voodoo, and Santeria. He also brainwashed his followers in a very similar way that Manson did by making them rewatch the movie Believers hundreds of times a week, similar to how Manson used the Beatles song Helter Skelter.
Mm-hmm.
But what started out as just reciting prayers to the Palo Mayombe gods for protection before driving across the Mexican-U.S. border with kilos of marijuana soon turned into animal sacrifices and then human sacrifices. At first, these human sacrifices were captured rival drug lords or corrupt cops who had not held up their end of a deal. But the longer it went on, the more random that the victims would become. The way these human sacrifices worked at the beginning is he had a concoction that he had people drink, and he claimed that this drink would provide protection to the gang and bring them more success. And the gang actually believed this, as not only did it get rid of rivals, but it made them feel invincible.
Jeez, I wonder what role or what purpose did sexually assaulting Mark have to do in this whole equation? Because you said that he also did assault, or he raped him, correct?
Yep, I
wonder what that had to do with his whole, how does that fit in?
I think that's a great question and one that I do not know the answer to.
Yeah, because it doesn't. Just sadistic.
And so remember I said it started out as, they were capturing these rival drug lords or corrupt cops. And then I said the victims became random. Some of the victims even were people that were well known to these men. One ended up being Elio's own nephew, a 14-year-old boy who had lost his goat and was abducted by another cult member and delivered to Adolfo with a bag over his head. Now, Elio says he didn't realize it was his own family member until the boy was killed and the sack fell off. So as media outlets swarmed the Santa Elena Ranch, when more and more bodies were uncovered, many families from the impoverished farms around the area wondered if their missing loved ones had been abducted and sacrificed by the Hernandez gang. And for many of them, the answer was yes. Of the 15 discovered bodies, only 3 were unidentifiable. And though so many families were overcome with grief that their missing loved ones had been brutally murdered by a cult, finally knowing what had happened and being able to take them home for a proper burial was more than many had hoped for. And if Mark Kilroy's family hadn't worked so hard to put pressure on this search for him, none of the cult's other 14 victims would have ever been found.
I just feel so horrible for families who have to learn this manner of death, this murder. I mean, it's so awful to have to hear that someone you loved so much went through this. It makes me actually feel sick inside for them. What happened? What happens to Adolfo and to all these other conspirators?
We'll return after a brief word from our sponsors.
Well, while the federales continued their investigation and hunted for leads on where Adolfo had gone into hiding, because after the bodies were discovered, of course, the main guy went into hiding.
Okay.
So the police were looking for him, and meanwhile, Mark's family returned to their home in Santa Fe to mourn. Now, on October 13th, 1989, a memorial service was held in Mark's honor at the Our Lady of Lourdes Catholic Church. And there were over 150 trees in the surrounding area that were pinned with yellow ribbons in Mark's memory. And hundreds of friends, relatives, and neighbors packed the pews to light candles and give prayers to Mark's family. And like so many other families that we featured on the podcast, the Kilroys put their grief into action. The family saw Mark's murder as a byproduct of the drug industry, and they worked with politicians to bring awareness to the fact that for every drug user, there is a victim who suffers from that other person's addiction. And while no official policies were put into play immediately after Mark's murder, the Kilroys created the Mark Kilroy Foundation, which is still going strong today. And this foundation provides education and information on drug and violence prevention and drug rehabilitation to the Santa Fe area. The foundation also offers annual scholarships to Santa Fe high school students, provides presentations to schools, churches, and community organizations on how to create substance abuse-free environments. They also run a free summer camp for youths of the Santa Fe area to keep them from becoming bored and getting into drugs. And this camp hosts between 400 and 550 students every summer.
Wow.
Mark's father also wrote a memoir with the help of an investigative journalist by the name of Bob Stewart. It's titled Sacrifice, and it is about the month-long investigation of Mark's disappearance. And all of the proceeds from this book go back into the foundation. Lastly, Santa Fe High School has a brick bearing Mark's name and graduation date as a memorial to him, and it's right in front of the school's administration building. So while Mark's family provided him with a legacy, the big question, and a one that you asked before, is would his killers ever be brought to justice? As I mentioned before, when word got out of what the federales had uncovered at the Santa Elena Ranch, Adolfo and several other higher-level cultists escaped to Mexico City. But it didn't take very long for law enforcement to find the hideout. They caught several other of Adolfo's followers as they hunted through the country and also worked with local police in Mexico City to find that several murders had taken place there that had mirrored the ones in Santa Elena. So Adolfo had not just kept his human sacrificing to that one area. Through tips and the arrests of other cult members, federales learned that Adolfo was hiding in an apartment in the Veronica and Zuri's neighborhood of Mexico City. Only 3 weeks after Mark's body was discovered, hundreds of federales surrounded the building, demanding Adolfo come out. In response, he fired a machine gun out the 4th-story window, but police were not deterred and they entered the building. Feeling desperate, Adolfo ordered one of the cult members to shoot him in the head with the machine gun. And by the time law enforcement arrived, Adolfo was dead, and the rest of the cult members surrendered peacefully. In total, 9 cult members stood trial for their crimes, and they were sentenced to between 30 and 67 years depending on their level of participation in the human sacrifices and the drug trade. Their trials and sentencing took a long time, but in May of 1993, the men who physically kidnapped Mark Kilroy, and again that would be Elio and Serafin, they both received 67 years in which they were charged for multiple homicides, possession of narcotics, involvement in organized crime, illegal desecration of a body, and illegal possession of firearms. Interestingly, Mexico does not have the death penalty or life incarceration. 50 years is about the harshest punishment that can be given, and usually those sentenced to 50 years have their sentences reduced. And this would end up being the case for both men. because in 1998, after several appeals processes, their sentences were both reduced from 67 to 50 years.
At least it's still 50 years, even though I have no idea why they would be entitled to a reduction. But I guess that seems more standard there.
Yeah, I think you're right. I actually was not aware that they were so much less punitive than we are here in the U.S.
Yeah, no,
although
neither
I
was
should have known. As of this podcast recording, they had both served about 31 years, and they have another 19 to go before their release. As of 2009, there were only 2 cult members still at large for the murder of Mark Kilroy and the 14 other victims. And while none of this could ever bring Mark back, the Kilroy family sent thanks to the Mexican justice system for putting away the men who had murdered their son.
Mm-hmm.
What was supposed to have been an amazing last spring break for Mark and his friends turned into a nightmare that no one could have expected. For Mark's friend, Ryan Fenley, who was supposed to be the 5th man on the spring break trip, but didn't end up going, says that the horror of losing his friend to something so evil and sinister has fundamentally changed him. He often ruminates on who Mark would have become had he not gone out that fateful night. In an interview for Fox 7, Ryan explained, quote, "Mark today would have been a medical doctor. He would have been 56 years old. He would have been done with UT, with med school. He would have had a family." Instead, Mark was brutally murdered, but through his legacy and the Mark Kilroy Foundation, the Kilroy family has been able to make a difference in the lives of over 1,000 students who have attended their summer programs and had been gifted their scholarships since the fund's inception in 1990. Not to mention, Mark's disappearance ultimately led to the downfall and incarceration of the Hernandez drug ring and the end of the Costanzo cult, as well as the recovery of 14 missing persons who would have never been found otherwise. Mark's murder was certainly awful and senseless, but as his parents once told the media, he did not die in vain. If our listeners would like to know more about the Mark Kilroy Foundation, you could check them out at markkilroyfoundation.org. Before we go today, if you'd like to support Campus Killings, consider subscribing to the show with an AbJack Insider subscription through Apple Podcasts.
Your subscription will get you VIP access to all the shows on the network that not only includes hundreds of episodes of ad-free listening, but also bonus content and early access to episodes.
For only $4.99 a month or $49.99 a year, you'll unlock a variety of listener benefits, and you'll be supporting this show in the process.
Head over to Apple Podcasts and search for either Campus Killings or AbJack, and you can start your subscription with a free trial.
Your support is greatly appreciated.
Thank you, everyone, for listening today, and we hope you'll join us on the next episode of Campus Killings.
Campus Killings is hosted by Dr. Megan Sachs and Dr. Amy Schlossberg,
with research and writing by Abigail Belcastro.
It's produced by Mike Morford of AbJack Entertainment.
Be sure to follow Campus Killings on social media.
You can find Campus Killings on Twitter with the handle @CampusKillings or on Facebook at facebook.com/Campus Killings. You can also visit the show's homepage at campuskillings.com. Be sure to tune in every other Saturday for new episodes of Campus Killings.